Welcome to this AMA episode. As always, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook if you want to leave a question for the next one in 2 weeks. So the first question comes from Craig Young. Craig says, when discussing some of the ideas which naturally fall out of your theory of consciousness, such as the illusion of the self and the interconnected nature of reality, I have noticed that some people can get very defensive. On the use of psychedelics, people compare them to soma, as if they were some sort of chemical which blinds you and puts you in a state of bliss to distract you from the suffering of the world. So that's, I think, a reference to soma, which is in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in this kind of dystopian future where people just kind of tune out using this drug. It's as if these people have confused suffering itself for the meaning of life, and now crave it to find meaning. Or when you talk to them about the illusion of the self, they see it as an attack on individualism, or an attempt to indoctrinate humans into some sort of dystopian hive mind. Have you come across such reactions to the implications of your philosophy, and if so, what do you make of them? I think more fundamental than those kinds of arguments about, some kind of indoctrination into a hive mind, what I come across a lot is the fact that, so the self exists as a kind of defense mechanism. It's a psychological concept that is there to help you survive. And people therefore identify with it very strongly, and if you try to suggest that it isn't what it seems, those very same psychological mechanisms are not going to take that lying down. They're going to kind of rally everything they can to dismiss this as an absurd claim, which is why spiritual practice is a thing, really. It's why meditation is a thing. It's why psychedelics can lead people to these states, because just telling someone this stuff, usually you're talking to the self. You're talking to the parts of the brain that uses language and tells these stories to reify its own existence. So it's going to be hard to cut through and really convince that process that it isn't what it thinks it is. I think it can be done. A lot of philosophy can do this, or some philosophy can do this. But it's primarily experiential, and that's why you need to put yourself in a situation where these processes can get out of the way, like with meditation, like with psychedelics, and you can see what's beyond them and understand what it is we're talking about when we talk about it being an illusion or not real, or whatever your favorite way of describing it is. I like the thing you say about confusing suffering for the meaning of life, and I think that it points to something quite poignant, really, that suffering is an inherent part of existence for living creatures. This is something that's foundational in observation in Buddhism, and for most of us, there isn't really a way out. It's kind of inevitable that there's some level of suffering in life. And I don't mean this, suffering carries a lot of weight. And what we're talking about here is just the kind of mundane, everyday suffering of just kind of thirst and hunger. And I'm not talking again about starvation or anything. I'm just talking about low-level dissatisfaction that constantly motivates you to do things like cook lunch or drink water or plan for the future. All these kind of low-level anxieties, low-level feelings of anything other than complete contentment. This just kind of chases us from the moment we wake up in the morning and propels us into action. And it's good that it exists, because otherwise we would die, because we wouldn't be propelled into action in this way. So this is the situation we find ourselves in, is that suffering is a necessary feature of our existence. So that's the kind of the paradox, I guess. I'm not a big fan of the paradox, but the kind of the bind we find ourselves in is that if you're going to exist and have this kind of wonder of being a conscious creature, part of that deal is suffering. So when we talk of there being a way to kind of cut through suffering or transcend it, if you've not experienced that yourself, then if you haven't kind of taken a step in that direction, it's going to sound implausible to you to begin with, and you're going to remain trapped in your suffering. And the fearfulness of the ego, because again, remember, the ego is a defense mechanism, so it exists primarily in fear, and worry for the future and worry for self-concern. The ego is going to rationalize and kind of come up with reasons that it shouldn't go out of its comfort zone and check out this stuff. So, the poignancy of it is that I think a lot of people are trapped with suffering, and then all you can do at that point is kind of rationalize as to why it's okay. And when I'm saying that suffering is an inherent part of life, I think that's true, but I'm not saying it's the meaning of life. That's not the best thing on offer. Suffering isn't the point of being here, I think. And I mean, not that I would say there is a point that's kind of, predetermined, but I think this kind of valorizing suffering as somehow noble, or an end in itself is a rationalization. So I think all of these things, these reactions, come under the predictable, everyday, kind of neurotic ways that human psychology tends to work, that keeps people trapped in suffering. And it's partly why I'm so passionate about laying out a scientific picture of this stuff, because if you can point people who would otherwise have these kind of defenses, if you can point them to a scientific picture of the world that they can analytically study and be convinced by, that's very different to the justifiable fear people have of kind of charlatanism and being taken advantage of. So, when someone says that they have a solution for your suffering, if someone says they have a solution that will end all of your suffering, that sounds like the biggest con person of all time. I don't know if you'd describe Buddha as the biggest con man of all time, if that's what people who aren't convinced by the philosophy would think of him as. Maybe they do. But it just so happens that he was telling the truth. He discovered genuinely important insights in what's taught in as the kind of secular, current of Buddhism. That's the kind of, when I say Buddhism, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, rather than certain kind of supernatural things that don't seem to fit with the modern scientific worldview. I think I have come across this kind of defensiveness, and it's to be expected, I think, and hopefully having a scientific way of thinking about it can help cut through that. So the next question comes from Andrew W. Andrew says, I'd like to know about the risk factors around meditation/consciousness work and psychedelics with regards to dissociative disorders. If someone recognizes the living mirror of consciousness, or states such as ego death, emptiness, or receiving the pointing out instructions of Dzogchen, how can they avoid harmful impacts of dissociation in their everyday lives? Yeah, that's a great question. So, just to make sure everyone's up to speed, this concept of recognizing what you describe as the living mirror of consciousness, I like the little nod to my theory and how you describe that, or the nature of consciousness as described in the Dzogchen teachings in Tibetan Buddhism, which is the closest parallel, I would say, in the kind of religious literature to the things that I'm trying to discuss around the nature of consciousness. This particular kind of insight is that consciousness is this kind of, the analogy of a reflectance is apt, because if you think of something like a crystal ball that reflects what's around it, it only has that capacity of reflectance because it's empty of any pattern in itself. If you have a rock that's so highly structured, it has so much of its own structure going on, that it can't reflect the world around it. Whereas with a mirror or something like a crystal ball, it's precisely because everything's so aligned and there's so little variance in the structure and the pattern of the reflective surface that you can have this reflection. And consciousness has this strange feature where it seems to be empty. It has no intrinsic essence except this kind of potent, reflective quality, or you might say self-illuminating quality. And everything that appears is being kind of, everything that appears in consciousness is being equally illuminated by this very strange kind of light of consciousness. So when you notice this, what you notice is this consciousness it's not confined to the appearances of yourself. You have this kind of sphere of consciousness, and then the tree in my line of sight is very much, it's as in that consciousness as what I take to be my body. And this is synonymous with dropping the sense of self, the sense of separation, and that's when suffering goes away. And in that state, you might see the bright light of the sun in your field of vision, and say you've stubbed your toe, and there's this, what until that moment had been painful suffering. In the moment that you drop the self and you recognize this nature of consciousness, the intensity of the pain in the toe it's still there, but it's no longer suffering. And you may not even want to call it pain. It's just like a bright sensation in the same way that the sun is like a bright sensation. And so that's what it feels like to drop suffering in this way. And there are two subtle different ways, I would say, that you can inhabit this state of consciousness. One is in an embodied way, where you feel. So there are two ways you could say this. You could say you feel yourself to be coincident with everything that appears. You feel yourself to be kind of in the appearance of the tree or the sun or your body. Or you could talk instead of everything becoming you could say self goes away completely and there's just what is. And what is fully coincident with what is. It sounds a bit absurd to say, but I'm trying to point to a certain experience. And so existence is fully coincident with the sensations. And so you're really in the sensations. And so it's very kind of grounded and embodied and feels healthy to the point where it's like psychological well-being and health you've never known before. Then there's no chance of it being considered in any way a disorder or in any way problematic. This kind of embodied way of having this non-dual awareness. But another way you can do this, which is kind of subtly different, is a kind of disembodied identification with consciousness. So you could recognize this kind of common characteristic of consciousness in everything that arises. And instead of focusing on the contents, you can be identified with the more ephemeral, kind of almost abstract kind of features of consciousness, the kind of self-illuminating, empty qualities of it. And in that state, you can really use that to escape from suffering in a way that's not balanced or integrated. So for me, there was kind of a period where I've most of the time it was the kind of embodied way of doing this, but when you're carrying kind of emotional distress or something like psychological pain of any kind, there can be this process of dissociation where if you think of imagine you're trapped in a room and there are kind of scary creatures around you and there's nothing, you can't run, you can't do anything. Well, what we tend to do in that state of anxiety is we get a kind of tunnel vision where we don't pay attention as much to the scary things and we just kind of narrow our vision. Imagine you're walking through a kind of creepy sewer with rats everywhere and there are just so many of them you can't respond to each one and scream, so you just have to kind of get this tunnel vision and you're just trying to not pay attention to them to kind of regulate your emotional response, because otherwise you would just be, if you're scared of rats, you would be freaking out all the time if every time you looked at one. And so this kind of tunnel vision, it's really the mechanism of, psychologically, it's really the fundamental mechanism of separation, this feeling that you go from feeling coincident with the rest of nature, and then fear kind of brings in these blinders and makes us kind of turn our attention to the body, to the kind of narrow focus on what's safe in the outside world. And then if the body feels threatened or the emotions that are in the body are too strong, there can be dissociation into the mind, into the kind of the story we're telling ourselves, an identification with the kind of language that's going on in our heads. And this is where most of us start as adults. If we come to meditation, we've already undergone this huge dissociation process where instead of recognizing our kind of continuity with the rest of nature, just the kind of innate stress of existence has, as well as the kind of deep alienation of our species, of being far from nature and carrying kind of intergenerational trauma from war and all this other stuff, has led us to be so, as a species, just kind of chronically traumatized and raising kids every generation with this kind of egoic tunnel vision, where we're kind of dissociated into this identity of the story we're telling ourselves, and we genuinely feel very, very separate from the rest of the world because we've backed ourselves down this tunnel. And you see this in the way philosophy of consciousness goes as well. Like, you can feel this tunnel vision that people have, that they feel like that humans are so separate from the rest of nature because we've backed ourselves down this tunnel and nature's all the way over there. I think this is why people find it so hard to understand or accept that other living creatures can be conscious, because it's part of this kind of this separation where they think, I'm so far removed from the rest of nature, this is all unconscious, I'm so far removed that my explanation of myself, it has to justify the separation, the suffering and separation from the rest of the world that I'm feeling. And all these assumptions are just kind of playing out. It just feels the way the world is, that I'm, really pulled apart from the rest of the world. So this is the kind of mechanism of dissociation. And what can happen is, in a really stressful event, you can even kind of dissociate from identifying with the kind of voice in your head and kind of this region of your body. And in that instance, people report feeling kind of like they're hovering just behind their body. And this happened to me once as well. And it's more like you're just disidentifying with everything that's here, and so you feel like you're somehow removed. Now, if you're in that state, if you're carrying a lot of trauma and you're experiencing dissociation, you can access these kinds of non-dual states in a way where it relieves the suffering, which feels great, it feels like what you want, and you're escaping from this kind of focus on the traumatic region of consciousness that's kind of triggering this suffering. And so this is different to the more embodied non-dual awareness that I spoke about before. And I think in that case, the doing that isn't harmful, I would say. I think it's what you might call spiritual bypassing. Like, kind of ultimately what would be good or optimal to happen would be to try and heal that trauma so that you can come into a more embodied way of being, where you're not kind of fleeing from anything and you're more integrated as a whole. So in the question you say, how can people avoid the harmful impacts of dissociation in their everyday lives if they recognize this nature of consciousness? Yeah, so I would say practicing this kind of non-dual awareness I don't think is harmful, but you would want to be moving in the direction of healing if you are experiencing some kind of dissociative disorders. It's not in itself harmful to dissociate, but it can be distressing, and it's more that it occurs at the end of a long chain of suffering, that you feel like a kind of loss of control, that it's not it doesn't feel reassuring to be in that state. I hope that answers the question. Okay, next question's from Stephen. Do you see any common trends or correlations between how easily someone can access what we're calling non-dual awareness and what the metaphysical beliefs and interpretations tend to be? E.g., someone who glimpses it once in a psychedelic trip versus someone who can just cut through to it at any moment. Yeah, so I think there's no, I would say I have any cut and dried kind of differences I've identified between those kinds of groups. When you talk about metaphysical beliefs and interpretations, there's a lot of talk in kind of spiritual communities about worldviews where only consciousness exists, which is not something I ascribe to. And there are teachers like Rupert Spira, who's a kind of non-duality teacher, who teaches very well on the non-duality stuff. I disagree with the kind of philosophical perspective of consciousness being the only thing that exists, but I'm sure lots of people in the audience don't disagree with that. But he uses the kind of philosophizing about this kind of ontology, about what exists, to try to elicit these kinds of non-dual awakening experiences in people. Now, I've never... To me, if I try and think about only consciousness existing, it actually takes me away from the experience, and it starts to get very kind of intellectual exercise that, and I start to wonder how it is that biology works, and if consciousness is creating biology and all this kind of stuff. So I definitely see there. I mean, in a lot of his talks, there are people asking questions who don't get it. Understandably, that's the point of these kind of question and answer things. And for them, it also seems to be a hindrance that they can't quite get over this. It doesn't seem to trigger the reaction, the intended reaction, and doesn't seem to fit with their understanding of their own minds. So in that case, I would say there's something going on there as to some, very much a relationship between metaphysical beliefs and non-dual awareness. But I can only assume that for lots of people, the belief that only consciousness exists matches nicely with the non-dual awareness, given that it seems to be such a strong association in the community. So, and then when you talk about the difference between someone who's seen it once on a psychedelic trip versus someone who can just cut through to it at the moment, I feel like the people like myself who have these strange, sudden kind of awakening experiences, they're usually triggered by psychological suffering of some kind, but they tend to carry a very kind of convincing weight to them. Like, you've just kind of seen something that's obviously true, and maybe there's a selection bias here because the people I'm talking about go on to write books like Eckhart Tolle and people, so obviously they're going to be convinced enough to write those books. But also people like William James, who studied psychology of religion, find this certainty in the truth of what you've discovered to be a strong feature of mystical experiences. The psychedelic experiences, I think it's far easier. You see a lot more of people dismissing them as just wacky experiences. It's far easier to say, especially in our culture, that I was on a drug. We don't have a narrative that drugs are supposed to give you insight. So it's far easier to dismiss any insight you might have had, or because you're in such a vastly altered state, to find it hard to integrate into your daily life and then just to kind of let it go. Whereas if it's happening on a normal day, as you're going about your normal life, when you're thinking about normal things, then I would suggest it's probably more likely to be aligned with your normal waking consciousness. Beyond that, I've not seen any kind of correlations or trends between different groups and how easy it is to access this stuff. I guess I would say maybe something that's surprising to people would be that the people I have read and listened to who've had these experiences, I think none of them, as far as I know, had anything other than the usual mainstream scientific kind of worldview before they had these experiences. And again, for me, that didn't change. So they're not people who are going around, by and large, again, the people that I know of, aren't people going around kind of deeply diving into strange kind of, alternate metaphysical beliefs and then having these experiences. Although I think Rupert Spira studied for a very long time in these kind of traditions before having his kind of experience. So there will be cases like that. But I think it's interesting to note that actually perhaps there is no relationship between your perspective on the world and then what happens inside your brain that kind of leads to these moments of recognition. Okay. Next question is from Andrew Castillo. Andrew says, "Good day, Dr. Cook. Thank you for providing deep insights into how we view consciousness. It's been a joy listening to your ideas." Oh, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on what's known as a tulpa, which in Theosophy, Tibetan culture, and forms of Buddhism is a mind-made abstraction which has gathered sentience and acts autonomously, and its potential connection to experiences of entities on NMDMT. Over the past decade or so, tulpa culture has seen a large increase in forums on the internet, and many have harbored into these discussion boards to talk about their tulpas and their various experiences with their tulpas. Many members of these boards claim these tulpas are as real as our dogs, our hands, and the computer screens, which we're looking at right now. While it isn't clear that tulpamancy, the process of creating a tulpa through deep meditation and forced summoning, is linked to dissociative disorders such as schizotypy or schizophrenia, some members have experienced multiple personality disorder, to which increases the tendency to claim other sentient forms surround their theatre of consciousness. It also isn't clear that tulpas are true mind manifestations. Tulpas may act as mental tools to help in everyday life and may act as a subconscious parrot to handle trauma, general thoughts or feelings. Nonetheless, based on anecdotal data about the presence of these thought forms affecting and intricately coexisting with the tulpamancer host, coupled with subjective reports of entity experiences through high doses of NMDMT trips, then there's 3 questions, do I believe that there could be a potential link between the perception of real, in quotes, real thought forms entities / tulpas with the release of DMT in the brain in certain states of consciousness and meditative states, given that it can be proven that human brain synthesizes DMT? two. Actually, I'll answer them one by one. So my first thoughts on this phenomena of tulpas. I hadn't heard of tulpas until I was at Breaking Convention last year, which is a kind of psychedelic conference in London. And I can't remember the name of the speaker, but he gave an excellent talk on tulpas. And it's a fascinating area. The thing that it kind of really that strikes me about it is that so you said you spoke about these as between the perception of real tulpas in quotes. This goes to the kind of question of what we think of as real, because when it comes to when we say real, we might assume we're talking about an entity that has its own kind of independent existence as a kind of solid, has its own solid identity. Most of the stuff we're talking about here is kind of pointing to the fact that all of reality is a process, where certain processes, like ourselves, tell stories and give ourselves labels of being separate selves, and that's fundamentally not true. And so the concept of James, which is a very kind of convincing, sophisticated, real concept, it does a really good job of making us think that there is an identity, there is a solid thing called James that exists moment to moment. But when you realize that that's not really the case, that there's a kind of a very loose collection of things going on that we label James, suddenly it opens the door to tulpas and kind of other selves existing within one organism that can have just as much reality as James. Not because we're saying it's somehow an extra soul or an extra identity that is some kind of solid thing that exists, but rather these processes have just happened to manifest two different, they've kind of clustered into two separate things rather than the typical one identity that most of us develop. So I think it's a fascinating way to study what it is to identify as a self, what it is to have a personality, especially that people can cultivate these things intentionally. I think it's very interesting. The links to DMT entities. So the first question is, do I believe that there could be a potential link between the perception of real thought forms, entities, tulpas, with the release of DMT in the brain in certain states of consciousness and meditative states, given that it can be proven that the human brain synthesizes DMT? So I think we have good reason to believe that DMT is most likely synthesized in the human brain. We're not sure in the adult if it's synthesized at levels that are really could produce any psychedelic effect, but this is all active area of study. So I would be the thing I just laid out of how I would view tulpas. I think beyond even just the kind of the specifics of a DMT experience, I think they give insight into the actual process of creating selves that we experience all the time. So, and on the other side, if it's more a feeling of you perceiving an entity within yourself, so this is slightly different. You've got me presenting to you multiple personalities, and you can say there's James and then he has another personality. Perceiving your own internal tulpa is a bit like entity detection on DMT, right? It's like there's this autonomous entity that you're seeing from within. Right now you're using your kind of entity detection capacities to detect me as a being rather than just a bunch of pixels. And in the same way, more than whether or not DMT triggers it, the interesting thing is the process that's triggered by meditation, DMT, whatever. And so I absolutely think there could be a link there, but it could also be a link to, as I said, like the psychology of how it is that you manage to detect me right now, or how it is you dream of other people when you're asleep. And it would be a very neat story if it turned out DMT was a kind of mechanism that did that. But that's a very simple, I think as a neuroscientist, I'm always, most theories that we're talking, I'm talking here about the kind of extremely smart professional neuroscientists, most theories humans come up with in that situation are reductionist. They're very simple theories like this chemical does it, and it's as simple as that. And when you study the brain, you realize it's a very complex system, and all of those stories are always not quite getting to the meat of really what's fascinating, which is, as I said, these kind of more complex processes of entity detection and creation. So it would be interesting if DMT mediated the kind of triggering of those processes, but I would say those are those processes in themselves are the things that are more interesting. And at this stage of the research, I really couldn't say if there is a link, but I'd be interested to know if studies can show a link between the two. The second question is, do I think this can help us to understand that if DMT does play a role in tulpa creation, that this can also help us understand if this role can also be replicated in creating entity experiences while on high doses of NMDMT? Yeah, I think yes. If we could study so I think we should be studying the psychology of tulpa creation alongside the study of how the human concept of the self develops, and as we get a richer understanding of that, I think you're absolutely right that we can use kind of synergistically use that understanding and also as research goes ahead on DMT, there should be communication between these two fields to try and see what the overlap is, and if we can, as you say, kind of this can help us to understand the role of DMT in this process with tulpas, or just whether there's a common psychological and neurological mechanism underlying both. And at this point, I'm not sure which it would be. It seems likely that there'd be a common process underlying both in the brain, and I have to be agnostic at this point as to whether DMT is involved. But yeah, it's an absolutely reasonable hypothesis to have. Although I guess we don't have enough data to know if meditation or these cultivation processes triggers any change of DMT in the brain. So I guess my professional scientific kind of perspective would have to be agnostic or skeptical until we had good reason to believe that DMT plays a functional role in the adult brain, because I don't think we know that it does at the moment. And then third, do I think that this could provide possible insight into the claims of people and historical religious figures, such as the apostles, or even the core leaders of religious movements, such as Jesus Christ or Muhammad themselves, meeting certain godlike entities or having profound revelations due to some sort of tulpa creation mechanism supported by the release of DMT in the brain? Yeah, I think there's an Israeli scholar, academic, I can't remember his name, who wrote a book on the idea that the burning bush was an acacia tree and that released DMT smoke that Moses inhaled, and that's what gave him his kind of vision of God in the burning bush. And I think it's I've also been visiting churches in Portugal where the sculptures of cherubs, these kind of fractals of cherubs kind of coming out of clouds, is the most DMT like imagery I've ever seen. And I doubt they were kind of smoking DMT or anything like that. So it does suggest that people have been accessing these kinds of states of consciousness through some other means routinely, and it produces these kinds of religious revelation kinds of experiences. So I absolutely think there could be a link there, to perceiving kind of entities with some divine, that seem to be these kind of divine immaterial angelic creatures, through some process in the brain that maybe, in that case, associated with DMT release. It's just so hard to get data on this stuff, on people having religious revelations, measuring, you can't measure their blood levels of different chemicals and things while that's happening, really. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating area. So he finishes, I've been researching this topic for the past 7 years, so I'd really enjoy your take on this. Thanks again, Dr. Cook. Yeah, I hope that wasn't disappointing, given I don't know that much about tulpas and if there is a link to DMT, but that's my speculations for now. Okay, now finally we have Joe Mikowski. Joe says, "Hey James, first time, I'm glad to be here. My question is regarding access concentration while entering the jhanas during meditation." So that's these kind of states of concentration during meditation. I noticed that my breathing becomes extremely shallow, which is followed by a great sense of joy and happiness. It feels very similar to the baseline love state that psychedelics can bring on. Question: Have you been able to enter these euphoric, blissful states simply by focusing on the breath and pleasant sensations alone? If so, can you explain a little what might be going on? Thanks. Yeah, so the concentration meditation is something that people don't, it's not quite the same as kind of mindfulness, but if you focus on your breath for a very long time, you can have these blissful experiences. Robert Wright, in his book Why Buddhism is True, writes about kind of accidentally doing this when he was focusing on his breath for a long time. And I think he describes it as a hit of acid followed by a shot of heroin in terms of how euphoric it was, which is, I think, to basically say off the scale of kind of normal, what you'd think you can experience by just focusing on your breath. Yeah, for me, I've not done kind of extended concentration meditation like that. Although, I've been on meditation retreats for like 3 days where you just focus on your breath. But that's in a kind of Vipassana context where you're moving on to kind of different kind of mindfulness that's not intended to produce these effects. On those retreats, I did feel euphoric, kind of blissful states. But for me, focusing on the breath tends to take me away from this non-dual awareness that's easier to just kind of drop into with kind of panoramic awareness. But the thing you're pointing to, the fact that there's this, would you say, a great sense of joy and happiness that feels like sort of similar to the baseline love state that psychedelics can bring on. I think this is one of the most important and fundamental and surprising aspects of consciousness, but also just being, which was a big surprise to me when I first noticed it, which is that beyond just awareness, beyond just the lights being on, when you stop doing, because it's the process of doing that creates the sense of self, and that's kind of what we are, really. If we are anything, we are processes of doing. And the more you unravel that process and you just come into being in the present moment and the sense of self drops away, there's awareness, the lights don't go out, there's still consciousness. And the character of that consciousness, it's something like transpersonal love that's beyond the self, love that's just there, kind of bathing everything, with no sense of a self or a relational feeling about I love this because that and I want this. All of that conditionality is gone, and there's just this potent feeling of euphoric, blissful desire for wellness of everything on earth and just maximal flourishing. And when you feel that for the first time and you recognize it as a kind of not something you're creating, but something that's being unveiled, something that's being revealed, that's always there, if you don't mask it with this kind of process of anxiously going about your day being yourself. From the perspective of the ego, that as we started off this AMA with talking about the inevitability of suffering, from that perspective, it feels like, come on, this can't be the case. This is too good to be true. Like it can't be the case that if I just stop and pay attention, there's transcendent blissful love. Like that can't be the structure of our reality and our experience. But I think it turns out it's the case. And when it comes to explaining this kind of scientifically, again, from the perspective of selves and egos, our understanding of the world, we're so used to thinking that like we create our emotions, we're the authors of our actions, we have free will, and it's all emanating from this ego. And it turns out that's not true. But coming from the perspective of this kind of dissatisfied selves, it doesn't seem to make sense that there would be this kind of feeling deep down there at the kind of baseline. But from the perspective of being that love, being that awareness, it makes all the sense in the world. That when you're in that state, it's wordless. You're not you've dropped the kind of conceptual machinery. But if you could put it into words, it would be just kind of existence itself saying like, well, what else am I supposed to feel like? If I'm not separate and struggling and inventing all of this unnecessary suffering, why would I feel like anything other than perfected bliss and love and ultimate compassion for everything that can suffer? And it makes so much sense. It feels like it's the only way existence could be when you're in it from that perspective. But then you come out and the voice in your head comes back and it's like, no, that doesn't make sense. How can it be? How can that be the bedrock of reality for us as these conscious beings? So I think it's the same in psychedelics, that you're having certain conceptual kind of machinery is being stripped away, and you're experiencing this feeling of resolution, this kind of bare, blissful state of love that's there at the bottom. And I think with concentration, all you're doing, it turns out that if you just pay attention to something, anything, you can, if you're committing to do that, you're committing to be in the present and just be and be aware. And as the kind of mental chatter dies down, you can access this, and it's there to be experienced. So you don't just have to take my word for it. Thank you as always for the great questions. As I said, the next one will be in 2 weeks. Go to my Patreon page, patreon.com/Dr. James Cook, if you want to leave a question for the next one. Yeah, and thank you for listening.